Like we've done for the last few weeks, our goals for this study, we're trying to do two things. The first one is we're going to look at a number of Old Testament stories to, number one, create an understanding of how to read them, maybe how to better read them might be a better way to say it. But the second thing we're trying to do is to figure out how to apply the truths we find in these texts. Last week we spent a bunch of time in Genesis 1. We did all kinds of stuff. We looked at the structure. We looked at some of what was happening in the background. We looked at some of why it was written. We compared it to other texts that came out of the same time period and the same geographical region. So we did all of this background work essentially to wind up at the place where we said Genesis 1 seems to be the divine perspective of creation. It seems to be an outline of creation from God's viewpoint. There are a couple of things I want to touch on as we keep moving forward, because we also spent quite a bit of time last week talking about the idea of chaos. And we talked about how God stepped into what the entire ancient Near East believed to be cosmic chaos, and then he created order. And we outlined together last week how when we walk through Genesis chapter 1, what we're finding is order created from chaos, and it moves more toward order. So the farther we go in Genesis 1, the more ordered the system gets. One of the things that I think is really important about that, and one of the things that I want us to note right out of the gate, happens in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And this is the moment in the story of creation where God creates mankind. And what he says is, let us create man in our image, in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So we have this moment where Genesis 1 is moving us from chaos into order, and then God creates mankind, and what he says is, let us make man in our image. Now, the word image is the Hebrew word salem, and the reason that's important is because it's possible for us in our modern reading of this text to think that when God says, let us make man in our image, he's talking about our physical appearance. And there's speculation that could possibly be true, because even the angels were created with a similar appearance. From people who have encountered them, I haven't, right? But from people who've encountered them, they describe them like a man. But this word image in Hebrew isn't about physical appearance. The word image in Hebrew is literally a word that means a representative. So there's this concept that happens when God says, let's make man in our image. Essentially what he's saying is, let's make a representative of us that lives in this creation. And one of the things that's interesting about that word is, as we look at all of the rest of the creation stories, kind of like we did last week from the ancient Near East, this is the only text, this passage in Genesis is the only text from the ancient Near East that describes mankind as made in God's image. So in all of the other texts, gods create gods, and the gods they create are made in their image. Or, for instance, there are other texts that use this same root word to describe a king having a son made in his image. But the idea isn't that they look alike. The idea is that the image is a representation of the other being. So God says, let's put a representative on earth. The reason that's important is because this word in Hebrew also carries with it the idea that the role is functional. We have a responsibility as an image bearer. And that responsibility traces itself back all the way back to Genesis, these first few verses in Genesis chapter 1. So what is our responsibility as an image bearer? One of the first things we can talk about right from our discussions last week is we have a responsibility to order chaos. There's a divine, let me say that a little differently. There's something divine that happens. There's something spiritual that happens when we bring order to something chaotic. This is the way God interacted in this chapter in Genesis. And when he says, let's make man in our image, the idea is man has a responsibility to do what we have just seen God do in these last few verses, to bring order to the chaos around him. Now, that idea of image also gets picked up again as we continue to look at these first few verses of creation, because the first thing that God does once we find him kind of hovering over this chaotic beginning in Genesis 1, the first thing he does is he says, let there be light. And then the text tells us that God separates the light from the darkness. This is another incredibly important idea in Genesis 1. And I would actually probably argue that the idea of the separation of light and darkness is, if it's not more important, it is at least equal to the idea of creating order in chaos. One of the Jewish rabbis, a very famous Jewish rabbi, once said, this idea of separating light from darkness is not just something that God has done in the beginning. It's a responsibility he's given to all of us. And our role in the world literally is to walk through our space, separating light from darkness. As we trace the ideas of light and darkness forward in Genesis, and then literally through the rest of the book all the way to Revelation, we find that God at the very beginning describes light as good. He says, this is good. And he creates this contrasting idea that darkness is not. And not only do we find that kind of tucked in this verse in Genesis chapter 1, but we find that that plays itself out throughout the rest of the book. As the scriptures continue, as the story continues, light becomes the embodiment of everything that is good, and darkness becomes the embodiment of everything that is evil. So much so that by the time we get to John chapter 1, which we also referenced a little bit last week, talking about Jesus, John says, Jesus, the Word was with God from the beginning. He's come into the world. He is the light of mankind. He's essentially saying that Jesus is the ultimate goodness. The thing that's interesting about that back here in Genesis 1 is when we start talking about the idea of what it means to be an image bearer in this text, is we not only have a responsibility to look around our world and order the chaos we see, but equally we have a responsibility to look around our world and to separate light from darkness. Now, what does that mean? Well, it probably means that as I'm walking through my world, I have a responsibility to try to distinguish the good from the evil. I have a responsibility to try to distinguish the best of what's around me from the worst of what's around me. And I have a responsibility when that happens, when I am capable of making that happen, I have a responsibility of supporting what is good, of embracing what is light, and turning away from what is darkness or evil. Man, I love this idea. I'm not sure it's possible for me to talk about the idea of light and darkness long enough, right? There's so much behind it that not only helps move us forward in our lives, but can drive everything we do. When I'm trying to make a decision, then I've got two options. One of the things I can do to filter those two options is light and darkness. Is one of these things good and one of them bad? If that's the case, man, that makes the decision easy. As we think about life decisions, even as we think about what constitutes sin or mistakes or poor choices, we have the ability to filter our world by trying to separate light from darkness. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a second and kind of wrap up our conversation of Genesis 1. And I'm going to do it like this. We said last week, we talked about the kind of this chaos that hides in Genesis 1. And now we've talked about light and darkness. And through Genesis 1, we find that we have a responsibility to be image bearers. And that responsibility means we become the representative of God here on earth as we, number one, bring order to chaos. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, there's another pretty prominent teacher who's on YouTube, frankly, who's teaching the idea of chaos. And it's become kind of like an internet thing where he said, well, you need to clean your room, right? Well, that's a great idea. It's a great starting point. Is my room chaos? Well, I should put it back into order. But the thing he misses is that there is something spiritual about that. Man, there was a musician named Rich Mullins, and one of the things he said once was, the most spiritual thing I can do today is fold my laundry. And it took me a while to really kind of get a handle on what he was saying, but this was his point, right? God steps into chaos and mess, and he fixes it, and he orders it. And we have a responsibility to do exactly that. Not only that, but we also discover that the first thing God creates is light. The first thing God calls good is light. And in that, we have a responsibility to separate light from darkness, to create light in as many places as we can, to bring light as the image bearer of God into as many places as we can, and then to allow those acts of goodness and kindness and mercy and justice to be his representative on the earth. This is what it means to be an image bearer. We talked last week just a little bit, though. The only other thing I want to touch on, I think, we talked last week just a little bit about how our community currently sort of in the church world interacts with the text in Genesis 1 like it's scientific. And one of the points we made last week was for something to be scientific, it has to be observable. Genesis 1 was not observable by people. It's the divine perspective. We're going to build on that as we jump into Genesis 2. So let's kind of move forward. Let me check my time real quick. Perfect. Let me move forward into Genesis chapter 2. Now, we mentioned last week, Genesis, the second creation story, starts in Genesis 2, verse 4. And what we find there is, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. One of the things I want us to do right at the outset of Genesis chapter 2 is to look at structure, right? So last week we looked at Genesis chapter 1, we broke it down into the 7 days, and we talked about the idea that the Hebrew people used the structure of the text to communicate ideas. And we find that there was all kinds of pattern there. Well, another pattern exists right here in Genesis 2:4. Sure, I can write it and you can see it. So Genesis 2:4 is what they call a chiasm or a chiasm. It's the idea is essentially that the text moves to a central point and then moves away from the central point in the exact opposite order. So what we find in Genesis 2:4 is the text says, this is the account, the generations, like we talked last week. These are the generations of the heavens. So we start here with heavens. And the earth when they were created. And then it reverses the order. When the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now, heavens, earth created, reverse, made, earth, heavens. one of the things that's interesting about this to note is that this is one of the only places in the entire book that refers to the earth and the heavens with the word earth first. Almost always, and when I say almost always, I think it happens 3 times. It might happen 4 times, but in the rest of scriptures, it always refers to the heavens and the earth. So this time, the fact that it says the earth and the heavens is structural. And it's structural because it's trying to drive us back to what it believes the central point of this verse is. Okay, that's what this idea of a chiasm does. It drives us back to the middle, and it's telling us the middle is what's important. Well, what we find here in the middle is the phrase, the Lord God. Okay? But what we find here in most of our English Bibles, if you're using the NIV or the NASB or the RSV, what you'll find in the text is, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. The problem is, that's not what the scriptures say. In fact, the King James actually translates this verse exactly from the Hebrew. And what the scriptures say is, on the day. Now, here's why that's interesting. We're told in Genesis 2:4, it literally says this. Let me read it to you literally. This is the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created, on the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. A number of modern translations have altered this phrase. And the reason they've altered this phrase is because they're trying to make Genesis 2:4 align with the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1. But it doesn't. In fact, not only does it not align with the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1, but it seems to contradict it. And it doesn't just seem to contradict it in this one verse, because the outline of Genesis chapter 2 is a different creation order than Genesis chapter 1. And this has been argued extensively, frankly. It's been argued extensively by scholars. And what they do is, as we move forward in Genesis chapter 2, man is the first thing that God creates. And then the text says, but I'll read it straight out of the NIV. What it says is, now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east in Eden. And so what they've done is, there's this man that gets created first, and then we find that God plants a garden, and we find that in the garden, animals are created and given to the garden. And every time God creates something in the text here in the NIV, it says, now the Lord had formed. And so in the structure of the text, in the language, they're giving space for Genesis 2 to reflect the creation order in Genesis 1. So what happens is, Genesis chapter 2, man is the first thing that shows up. Okay? And then it says, now the Lord God had formed a garden. And the language that they're using is very specific. In fact, this is so technical, and I'm sorry I'm going to do it, but I think it matters. The phrase, now the Lord had formed, or the Lord planted, or anytime you see that text, what they're doing is they're using a translation of a Hebrew verb, and the translation they're using is called the pluperfect. And that's just a fancy way to say they're explaining that word by saying it means the past of the past. So that word form is like extra past, right? So we find in Genesis 2 that the chapter starts off with man being the first thing that God creates, but then the language suggests that God created a garden before he created man. Now God had planted a garden. And then the language suggests that God had created these other things before man. Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground the beasts of the field. There's this, he had already done it, kind of tucked into the way those words are translated into English. The problem with that is that only happens in English. It doesn't happen in the Hebrew. In fact, the difference between translating the perfect tense of a verb, which is just past tense, or the pluperfect tense of a verb in Hebrew, which is the extra past tense, there's no distinction. It's context. I decide whether or not I want a verb to reflect something that's extra past. Okay, so now, what have I just done? Let's have this conversation for a second, right? Because it sounds like I just said, Genesis 2 says God created the entire earth in a single day. And Genesis 1 says God created the entire earth in 7 days. Those two things don't seem to line up very well. Now, part of the problem with that is, number one, I'm not exactly sure what to tell you to do with that. But what I do know is, for me to make this text scientific, where I say this text has to fit a scientific worldview of creation, and creation had to have happened in 7 literal days. For me to make Genesis 1 scientific, I have to ignore structure, form, and word usage in Genesis 2. It's the only way to do it. Now, what's interesting about this word right here, this particular phrase right here, as we keep digging into this thing, is it's the Hebrew phrase beyom, on the day. It could be translated in the day, which means we could argue that this idea of it's possible to make the language say, in the day the Lord created, and use that as a general term for an expanse of time. Okay? So it's possible for us to say, like, okay, well, man, does this phrase is it actually referring to, like, millennia? Or is it referring to 7 days? But we're just going to talk about that expanse of time in a single day. The problem with that is it's the same word day in Genesis 1 as it is in Genesis 2. And most scholars who are teaching that the earth is 10,000 or so years old will say that Genesis 1, the word day in Genesis 1, has to mean a literal 24-hour day. If that's the case, Genesis 2 probably has to mean a literal 24-hour day. And if that's the case, now what do I do with that? Well, let's look at every time the phrase beyom is used in the Hebrew text. If we look at every single time the phrase on the day is used in Hebrew in the Old Testament, it's always referring to one specific day. It's never referred to as an expanse of time. Why on earth did I just camp here? Because this, man, I'm already uncomfortable and I've just been talking about it, right? Here's one of the things that I think is really important about the contrast we find between Genesis 1 and 2. The last thing we said last week was that Genesis chapter 1 gives us a picture of creation from the perspective of God. We get a divine picture of how the earth was created. When we get into chapter 2, verse 4 and forward, what we find is a very human-centric version of creation. Chapter 1 uses almost exclusive, almost is the wrong way to say it, uses exclusively divine language and gives you divine perspective. In chapter 2, we get man's view of this same window of creation. Only in chapter 2, what we find is it's very, I'm not sure how else to say this, man-centric, right? So much so that it tells us God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. And as he keeps going, in Genesis 2:10 it says, a river watering the garden flowed out of Eden. And from there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is ... And then they list 4 rivers. At least 2 of them we know were actual rivers. Most scholars assume all 4 of them were historical rivers in the ancient Near East. And 2 of them, they are kind of, at this point, the general assertion is that 2 of them probably dried up. It's kind of interesting when you do geomapping from way, way high, you can see dried riverbeds all over it. So they even have an idea of where one of those rivers might be. That's not the point. The point is, as they're writing Genesis 2, they give us very specific geographical location for where God created the Garden of Eden and where he put man. Well, from God's perspective, does he need a geographical map to figure this thing out? No. Right? So who is this text for? It's for us. Now, I'm not suggesting we ought to be able to go over and hike these rivers and find the Garden of Eden. But this at least tells us that whoever wrote Genesis chapter 2 believed Genesis chapter 2 was referencing a physical place, a literal physical place on the earth. Okay? And they're doing this because they're painting this picture of why creation mattered to mankind. God makes man, and he sticks man in a garden. And in this garden, God puts man in charge of the plants, and he puts man in charge of naming the animals and caring for everything in this place. Now, one of the things that's I think is really important about what happens here is that the imagery we find here in Genesis 2 concerning the Garden of Eden is unique. And it is unique in the entire ancient Near East. There are no other texts that describe a God creating and creating the perfect place, essentially. So in Genesis 2, we find that God creates this garden, and the garden is paradise. Man does not have to work. He gets to hang out and eat whatever fruit grows there and play with the animals, right? And kind of care for what's around him. But what's really interesting about this garden in Genesis chapter 2 is that maybe it's interesting because of my perspective, but I always read this text as God created a garden to put mankind in. Right? This is a pretty kind of logical conclusion to draw when we read, like, God makes man. Now God had formed this garden. God puts man in this garden. Man hangs out there. Garden's for man, right? You get to eat from the trees. This place is for you. But again, if we think about what we discovered as we were looking at the story of David and Goliath, that's assuming this text is about me. Right? And if I flip my perspective and think that this text is about God, what does the text tell us about the Garden of Eden? It says that God has planted a garden. And nowhere in the text do we find that the garden is referred to as man's. It's always God's. And what's interesting about that is God created the perfect space for mankind to have relationship with him. This is the place man encounters God. It's the place man interacts with God. And in that encounter and interaction, we find something really interesting happens as we move forward through the text, which is God eventually tells his people, build me a temple. And when we start to evaluate the space that God created in the temple, we find there are a number of things that reflect directly back to Genesis chapter 2 in the garden. And if we jump all the way forward to the very end of the book, at the end of Revelation, where we find this teaching about the ultimate picture of man in relationship with God, in unending, unbroken relationship with God, where the earth has been healed, our sin has been restored, and we are now in the perfect relationship. One of the things it tells us in Revelation is that the springs of water flow out of the throne of God. So there's this reference back to the original garden, right? The waters flow out of this garden. It's a reference to God being the source of everything, but the temple where we meet him, the place where we show up and encounter and interact with him, is a paradise that was created at the very beginning. God's intention was to create space for mankind to interact with him. So let's think about that idea as image bearers. Right? If I am an image bearer of God from Genesis chapter 1, and I have a responsibility to be a representative of his on earth. As I walk through my world and create order out of chaos. As I walk through my world and I bring light into places that are darkness. As I walk through my world, literally separating the things that are good and right and just from the things that are evil and sinful and broken. I'm essentially acting as God's representative to continue to create space where we and other people encounter God. It's a really, really cool idea when we lay these two texts together and say, theologically, what are these things teaching us? Well, we're learning a ton of theology out of Genesis 1. I have a responsibility as a representative of God to live a certain way. And then in Genesis, we can take that concept and pull it forward into Genesis 2, where we start to find out that my responsibility includes not only being in relational interaction with whatever this divine being is, but it's also making sure that the chaos gets pushed aside and light gets brought into our world in a way that creates space for others to also relationally encounter this divine. Sorry, I thought it just kicked me off again, and I don't think it did. So, again, crazy cool idea theologically that gets built in these two chapters. Now, we're going to jump forward again to Jesus, because the very first thing we did when we started these conversations weeks ago was we looked at Luke chapter 24, where Jesus he has a Bible study essentially with these two guys, and he tells them, everything you find in the Old Testament is about me. Everything, right? So if that's true, then what we're finding in these texts also has to reflect Jesus. Okay, now, one of the things that I find fascinating about this idea of the story of creation in Genesis 1 from the divine perspective, the story of creation in Genesis 2 from the human perspective, and these two stories join together to form a theological picture of how we should live and interact in our world. This is exactly what we find when we look at who Jesus was. For thousands of years, 2,000 years, Christians have argued that Jesus was the ultimate combination of the divine and the human. And Jesus joins these two separate worlds, for lack of a better way to say it off the top of my head. He joins these two separate worlds together into one complete unity. And then that unity walks literally through history, through space and time, acting out, behaving, acting, living in his world. Well, what are the things we find Jesus lives out? Well, Jesus walks into his world. John tells us right at the beginning and says he is light. We see Jesus offer grace and mercy and forgiveness, and in some places justice to the people around him. Jesus is carrying himself in a way that demonstrates light from darkness. Jesus, in fact, is also carrying himself in a way there in a number of times where you see him create order from chaos. That's one of the stories of Jesus is there are thousands of people gathered to hear him teach, and no one has any food. And so he calls this little boy forward, and he finds the boy has some bread and some fish, and Jesus divides these things. He separates the bread and the fish, and there's enough to feed everyone in this crowd. What has he done? He's taken this chaos, and he grabs a couple of things in the chaos, and then he uses them to create order. And this is not the only time this happens. We find this over and over and over again in the life of Christ. And so there's essentially Jesus steps into his world, and he grabs these initial pieces of the divine. We can watch it happen as we watch him live. And he pulls these pieces out of Genesis 1, order from chaos, light from darkness, and then he lives them out. So Jesus is essentially the ultimate combination of both stories of creation. He is all of the divine, coupled with all of the human, merged together, and then he says, live like this, right? What am I supposed to do as a Christian in my world? I'm supposed to walk through my world in a way that orders the chaos, that brings light to the darkness. This is what it means to follow after Jesus when we start using New Testament language. I'm supposed to be the divine representative in my world, bringing light to darkness and order to chaos. And all of those ideas originate here in Genesis 1 and 2. But they originate here in Genesis 1 and 2, and we find these things start coming to the surface when we try to step away from the way we have been taught to read these texts. Now, I want to make a couple of things clear just to try to, there's no way I'm going to ease some of the tension I've already created, and I get that, and that's good, honestly. And I think it's good because we have a responsibility to come to the scriptures and read the stories and eliminate as many of our preconceived notions as possible to understand what it says to us. One of the things that I think we have done to our own detriment is to take science from the last 150 years and demand that my spiritual text line up and agree with that science. Or maybe even more so, that the text should inform my scientific worldview in a way that the authors of the text never intended. Okay? But if we're willing to just take a moment and set that aside and then start digging into the theology we find here, what we end up discovering is that a picture of Jesus becomes crystal clear in these stories of creation. Not only that, but the way we should live in our world as image bearers becomes crystal clear in these stories of creation. As soon as we get past the idea that my person is central to the story, and that, we talked about it a couple weeks ago, as I am the hero in all of these stories. As soon as we're willing to set that aside just for a moment, what we discover is the garden wasn't created for me. The garden was created as a place for God to dwell on earth and interact with his creation. It was about him. It still is. Our ability to bring order to chaos is ultimately about our ability to set aside what's around us and directly connect with the spiritual that's happening. Our ability to bring light to darkness is ultimately about us setting aside what is happening around us and interacting directly with the divine. And there's a sense for me where we have to be able to do this even here in Genesis 1 and 2. We have to set aside our preconceived notions about what these texts are saying and figure out how they directly apply to us. And I think, if we look at the text in these ways, we find a more, I don't even want to say better, we just find a way to understand the stories that not only directly impacts who I am, but it directly impacts who I am and how I live and reach out into my world. Trying to not step on myself. And I at least think that we could argue pretty well, we could make a pretty strong argument that says that is way more important than whether or not the earth was created in 7 24-hour days. And I think we could at least create an argument that says that's way more important than whether or not the earth was created in 1 literal day. And I think we could even argue that from God's perspective in Genesis 1, the earth was created in 7 days because he was bringing order to chaos. And he did it in a way that created these very specific sections of structure. I think we could argue that from Genesis chapter 2, from our perspective, it doesn't matter how long it took him to create it, right? And from my perspective, it could have been one day. It could have been millennia. I'm not suggesting that evolution is true or any of the other heretical things I'm going to get accused of when this video is over. What I am suggesting is that how long it took God to do what he did just might be less relevant than why the text tells us he did it in the first place. And the reason I think it tells us why he did it in the first place is so that we understand we have a responsibility, not an optional choice. We have a responsibility to act as the divine representative on earth and bring order to the places we find chaos and light to the places we find darkness. And as we walk through our world with this joint mindset of God's perspective and man's perspective, what we find is Jesus ultimately says, love God, love man. We find this idea of divine perspective of this relationship and human perspective of this relationship wrapped up in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter